Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on easy photo editing apps. Just want to note that this presentation is in no way comprehensive, so you may have some favorite tools, tips, and expertise that I don't include here. You may have some stuff that you use on a regular basis that I don't talk about, and some of these tools that I'm exploring today may change by next week, since that is the nature of these sorts of apps and technologies and softwares. Before we get started, you may want to just take a minute to pause this video and think about what you currently use to edit your photos, if you use a combination of apps, if it depends on where you're at, whether you're on your phone or on your computer, and what you actually prefer in terms of editing. Do you prefer to do it on your desktop computer so you have more space and a bigger screen, sometimes more robust tools? Or are you pretty much always on the go and you prefer to have, a handy, trustworthy mobile app that you want to stick with? Today we're going to talk about photo editing tips and strategies. So some of the basics that are available on pretty much any platform, and then some things that you may have seen before in those platforms but never actually used. Also, we're going to talk about some of those platforms for photo editing, and then hopefully after you watch this video, you'll get into some of these tools and play around a little bit. So in terms of tips and strategies, the biggest thing that I can recommend is that you find a tool that you like to use the best. If you're always using the same tool, no matter whether you're on your phone or you're on your desktop, it's going to make much shorter work and much more enjoyable work of photo editing if you find the one that suits your needs the best. Aside from that, you want to obviously, this might be common sense, but you obviously want to start with taking the best base photo that you can. So if it's possible, make sure that you're shooting in natural, indirect light. Using a tripod, if at all possible, really helps the quality of your photos. So unless you're a person that has shot a lot in the past, a tripod can be super helpful. Some popular tools that we're going to talk about today is cropping, brightness and shadows, adjusting saturation, hue, contrast, and also using the curve tool that is available in most of these editors that I'll be talking about today. And this is one that typically people have seen in those different platforms but never actually used or explored. So we're going to talk about that one. Most of us know what it means to crop a photo. We obviously want to take just a bit of that photo to refocus on the subject. That way, there's a little bit less dead space, whether it's just size requirements or whatever it is that you need to crop that photo for. Some of us may be more familiar with using cropping tools that are embedded into things like Microsoft PowerPoint or Microsoft Word. But these are also options available in high-quality editors. And this, if you use an actual editor, will allow you to pay attention to the resolution of your photo as you're cropping. So if you crop too much of that photo, your photo is going to be very small and low resolution. So you're not going to be able to use it in something like, a presentation that you are displaying in front of a room full of people. You also want to make sure that you're meeting the requirements based on the platform that you're trying to use. So this example that I'm using on this slide here is a lovely headshot taken by our in-house photographer. But when I tried to upload that to our website as my profile picture, it automatically cropped for me and didn't give me any options. And I was sort of split right in half. So the focus was kind of right down the middle. And it didn't work for me. So I had to go into a high quality editor and refocus on the subject myself and crop the photo myself. And sometimes you just want to make sure that you know the requirements of resolutions or dimensions before you actually upload your photo. Another thing that you can adjust is brightness and exposure. So you might think that brightness and exposure are the same things. but they actually aren't. So exposure is basically how much light you're letting into your camera when you take your original photo. And a lot of these tools allow you to sort of tweak that exposure after the fact. But sometimes that focuses on the brightest parts of your photo because it is trying to recreate that original feel. Brightness, on the other hand, focuses more on midtones. So you may want to sort of play with both of these before you decide on which one that you want to actually adjust. But it's just good to know that these are not the same things. Another thing that you can look at adjusting is highlights and shadows. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. You can lighten or darken highlights and shadows. So you can lighten the lightest parts or darken the darkest parts or vice versa. So sometimes this works, for example, if you have like a lot of dark greenery, if you're shooting in like a forest or something like that, and you'd like to lighten some of those shadows to give just a little bit more detail to that greenery, you might want to sort of lighten those darkest parts, so lighten up the shadows a little bit. This is just a little bit more specific than brightness and exposure. So rather than, lightening the brightest parts or making the whole image a little bit brighter, this is going to either brighten or darken those very specific parts of your photo. Some other things that you can adjust is the saturation. That makes your colors either more deep or vibrant or just a little bit more neutral. So you can make those colors really bold or you can lessen them so that it doesn't, it's not quite as bold. It's a little bit more neutral. Hue or temperature can also really change the feel of your photo. So this is where you can sort of warm up or cool down a photo. And depending on which platform you're using, which tool you're using, it may be hue or it may be temperature. So that's why I'm sort of including both of those terms. This is particularly useful on footage from inside or under artificial lighting or low lighting. Sometimes you'll see that when you're shooting in those situations, you have a little bit of a yellow tint to your image, and if you want to cool that down a little bit and take some of that yellow out, you would cool down or lower the hue or temperature in that photo. So this example over here on the right is just a good, this one wasn't taken in outside, or this one wasn't taken in inside lighting or artificial lighting or even low lighting, but it just is a good explanation or example of warming up or cooling down a photo. So it has a totally different feel depending. One might be sort of like early afternoon, one might be a little bit more toward evening. It just gives a different feel to the place that I'm shooting. And then finally, you can also adjust for contrast. So this contrast does for color what highlights or shadows does for brightness. So if you up the contrast, it's going to make your darks darker and your lights lighter. If you lower that contrast, it creates a much more neutral look. So the tool that most people may have seen in these different editors, but not necessarily played with or explored, is the curves. So I actually typically start with curves. I think it's more of a one-stop shop. So it deals with color and brightness at the same time, so you don't have to adjust all of those other things like maybe brightness and exposure and saturation, contrast, all of those different things. So what you've got here on the right is this grid, and you've got this straight diagonal line, and it's a little bit of a misnomer sometimes to people because the tool is called curves, and you open this curves and see just a diagonal line. There's no curvature to that line whatsoever. But what you've got is this line is sort of your range of brightness and color. And what you do is you create curves out of this line depending on the effect that you want. So you can add several points to this line, and you can drag it up, down, left, and right. And what your goal is to make the curves out of that diagonal line. So if you want to switch out brightness or change up the brightness, you put a single point in the middle and you can drag that up and to the left or down and to the right if you want to make it darker. And then contrast, if you want to tweak the contrast, it's more of an S curve. So you're going to put that on top and bottom. So 2 points, and you're going to make sort of an S curve. So again, that's just much more of a one-stop shop, dealing with color and brightness at the same time. So I sort of always start here just to give me a base for my editing. So many of us just sort of use Instagram for our photo editing, but you'll notice whenever you Google or go to the App Store to find photo editors, there are just a million different options for you to look at. So I'm going to talk about some of these today. Some of these are mobile only. Some of these are mobile and available on your computer, whether it's in a browser or you have to download it. Some of these are also more freemium programs. So there's a free version, but you have to upgrade to get more premium features. So we're going to deconstruct some of these here in just a second. So before you get started, just how to choose. Again, you want to consider your needs and your priorities, and you want to find one that you enjoy using and stick with it. It may be the case sometimes, especially if you use a free program, that eventually this stops being merely free and becomes more of a freemium program where you get inundated with ads or something like that. So you may find one that you enjoy and you try to stick with it, but then eventually it just gets maddening and you have to find something else. That has happened to me before, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But for now, just try to find one that you enjoy using and stick with that. Again, it's going to make much shorter work of your editing and much more enjoyable work. So in terms of your needs and priorities, you want to think about whether you're on the go or at your desk, if you want something that's convenient, if you want something that's efficient. If most of what you're going to be doing is sharing over social media or sharing over email or things like that, you'll want to weigh in, or you'll want that to weigh in on your decision. If you really need high resolution downloads or a more professional look, if you want more advanced editing options, you'll want to think about that. And if you really are going for a consistency of style, you may want to consider a higher end program that allows you to do more like presets for your editing. So thinking about all of those things before you get started. So again, I mentioned that some of these are just mobile editing, some of these are computer editing, some of these are both. So I'm going to deconstruct this now for you. So I've got these all set up, and obviously this is not every photo editor that's out there, but these are some that I have explored personally and can give some feedback or advice on using. So I've got this set up from sort of a very low learning curve, very easy, very intuitive to use, to the higher end, the higher learning curve, the little bit more higher entry point for use. So again, you can think about that in terms of your needs and where you're at. If you need something that's more on the very easy and intuitive side rather than the higher learning curve, then think about that when you're choosing. So this first one that we're going to look at is called Snapseed. It is free and not freemium. It's a very easy and simple interface, but it has lots of very robust editing options. But it's also very low entry point, so it's very simple to use. Photor is another one that I like to use, and that's the one I just showed you when we were looking at curves. It is very robust, and it is both available on your mobile device and your web browser. So if you're using your mobile device, it does require you to download an app. If you're using your computer, you do not have to download any software. It's all run out of your web browser, so that can be kind of helpful. It can also be a little bit of a downfall because you are required to have a Wi-Fi connection or a grounded connection in order to be able to use it. So you want to think about that. It is very robust. It is a freemium program, so that does require that if you want super advanced options, then you may have to pay for that or upgrade to a more premium account. I will say that in terms of the free content and the free functionality, it is much easier to distinguish free content and free features on the web browser than on the mobile app. So that is something that you want to keep in mind. If you are someone that only likes to use your mobile device for editing, you may not want to use Photor just because it's a little bit more difficult to figure out what is free and what you have to upgrade for. Here we have Photoshop and Lightroom made specifically for mobile devices. So you'll see over on the right hand side, I'll talk about Photoshop and Lightroom. This is the mobile only version of that. I will speak to both of these. They're both very robust because they are Adobe products. They're free. They're not distracting at all. It's easy to find what you need. It's not a freemium program, so you're not going to get inundated with ads. I will say that it has a slightly less intuitive interface than something like Snapseed, that first one we were talking about, but it does offer very high resolution downloads, which I think is an important feature of these two. PicsArt is this one here in the middle. This is a mobile only app, so you can't do anything with it in your mobile or in your computer browser or on your computer. It has tons and tons and tons of editing options. It's really great. Some cool collage capabilities and fun effects. So if you're more into a fun photo editor, more for social media sharing and things like that, this is a really good one. I will say that this is one of those that I found really early on and really enjoyed using. So I stuck with it for a really long time, and now there are tons of ads. It prompts you to pay all the time and upgrade to the premium features, and it's really distracting, so it's not as enjoyable to use anymore as it once was. So I've sort of, even though I have a few things that I go in there for, since it was my old faithful, it's one that I tend to stay away from now. So that's why I kind of put it right in the middle. It is pretty easy and intuitive, but it has a ton of capabilities. And now there are plenty of ads to keep you distracted and frustrated. Another app that you can use is Pixlr, and this one is both mobile and browser-based. So again, just like Photor, you've got a mobile app if you're using it on your mobile device. If you're using it on your computer, it's all done in the browser, so you don't have a download, but you also need to have a Wi-Fi or internet connection. The nice thing about Pixlr is that it does get into some advanced layering on the desktop version. So if you're familiar with or have used a little bit of Photoshop, if you want to do a little bit more manipulation of your photos and not just color grading and that kind of thing, you may want to check out Pixlr. I believe that it has an overly simplistic design on the mobile app. I think that also makes it sometimes difficult to know where things are. I think the in-app icons are a little unclear, and they don't always sort of align with what everything is. So, this may change tomorrow. They may change their in-app icons, and it might be completely clear. So I wouldn't let that necessarily take away from the effect of Pixlr. You may find that it is intuitive and easy to understand. So it's definitely worth checking out. And again, these tools change all the time, so that's something that you want to keep in mind, especially if they're mobile or browser based, because they can change them daily if they want to. And then here we're getting into the straight desktop programs, these last couple. Here we have Photoshop and Lightroom. I'm sure you've heard of these before. These are Adobe products. They have advanced layering capabilities. In Lightroom, there are presets available, so if you want that consistent look, if you're an avid photo editor and you're sort of always going for that same tone, this might be one that you consider. These are the industry standards for professionals. So if that's you, or that's kind of in your wheelhouse and you want to learn these, by all means, feel free. Something to know about the Adobe Creative Cloud is that it does require a monthly fee. So you'll have to pay for these programs monthly, or you can access them here on campus, and you can contact me to find out how to do so. But the nice thing about these, it is a higher learning curve, but there are just tons and tons of learning materials out there available to you, whether they be video tutorials or web tutorials of some kind. You're never really going to have a shortage of information out there on Photoshop or Lightroom. So that's something to keep in mind. That's super helpful if you ever have a question when you're using it. It's very easy to Google and find a forum where someone else has asked that question. And then the last one that I'll include here is GIMP. GIMP has been around for a very long time. It's got advanced layering. In terms of the presets that I was talking about in Lightroom, I don't know of any that are available to install into GIMP, but that could change. This one is free, so you don't have the monthly fee, which is pretty awesome. But I put this as a higher learning curve than Photoshop or Lightroom merely because there are not as many tutorials out there on how to use it. Not as many forums, so if you search the internet for questions specific to GIMP, you may have a harder time finding that information. So even though it may not necessarily be harder to use or have a higher learning curve to break into, I think with the lack of tutorials that are out there and the lack of help, Photoshop and Lightroom are a little bit easier to learn than GIMP. Now that we've talked a little bit about all of these different tools and tips and strategies, I recommend that you just pick a couple of these that you'd like to explore and go do it. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me, and I hope this was helpful.